Hi, I'm Yvette Benavides. I'm the host of Texas Public Radio's Book Public podcast. Book Public's been on the air for about 3.5 years now. We started in 2020. And it's a podcast, but now we're on video. And there's a very special reason that we're coming to you on this video on the YouTubes. And it is that my guests today are Sandra Cisneros and Phillip Santos. Welcome. I could not be happier to have you here and to have you be the first authors that I can talk to in this context. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks. I'm having a incredible deja vu. 40 years later, this is when I arrived 40 years ago in January of 84.
That's right.
Yeah.
Very auspicious.
And my book too. We both appeared in Texas at the same time.
And the book is The House on Mango Street. And the other reason that we're here is to talk about something really spectacular, which is the 40th anniversary edition publication of The House on Mango Street from Everyman's library. That's something so special. And that's what we're going to talk about today, The House on Mango Street, but also Everyman's library. I want to ask you, Sandra, something, maybe it's an unusual question, but maybe not. Everyman's library has such a special place in my memories as a child who loved to read. What is Everyman's library about for you? Were you aware of it when you were a young girl thinking about learning to write and wanting to be a writer?
No. I have to say, I didn't think about editions or, certainly when I got older and, looked longingly at hardcover books, but I couldn't afford books like that when I was growing up. And usually the books I had were borrowed from the library. So the fact that it existed, I don't know how long it's been in my consciousness, but it's unreal for me because, one, I'm not a man, and two, I'm not dead.
Right. Okay. So this idea, maybe John, maybe you can explain to us, what does it mean to have, what is the Sandra Cisneros' literary influence in the context of Everyman's library?
Well, it's extraordinarily auspicious and important that House on Mango Street would have this 40th anniversary reappearance under this imprint. The imprint is over 100 years old. I don't know the exact birth date of the Everyman series, but the idea originally was to create affordable editions of world literary philosophical classics. So, Plato's Republic and a little bit of Shakespeare and maybe some Wordsworth. Important to note, on the occasion of the 40th anniversary of Mango Street and its imprint under the Everyman's Library series, this is the first book in the series by an American Latinx writer. It tells you something about the place of Mango Street in literary culture, but it also says something about how long it took Everyman's Library to include these kinds of letters. What it means for that series, as auspicious, as legendary and historic as it's been. The first voice we get is Sandra's.
What is that? What do you think it is about the House on Mango Street that has just captured people's attention for 40 years? And it's sold over 7 million copies. It's been translated to, what is it, like 26 languages, something like that? I mean, it's out there in the world, Sandra.
I have no idea. I don't know. I think that, sometimes a book captures the spirit of an age. I'm very lucky that this book does that. I wrote it with all my heart for others. I think that's part of the secret. I didn't write it to win awards or to get published in Everyman's edition. I wrote it as a high school teacher who loved her students and didn't want to see them harmed. and wish them the very best lives that they merited. And I just didn't know how to make that happen. So I just wrote with all my heart and with no ego involved, no self-gain. And I think that's what House has taught me, that whatever we create con puro amor y amor puro, siempre sale bonito. Whatever we create with absolute pure love, with the purity of no ego involved, is always going to turn out well. That's the one thing I know for sure of the laws of the universe that has touched the 69 years I've been on the planet.
Well, John Philip Santos wrote the introduction for this edition of The House on Mango Street. And he talks about and quotes his daughter talking about what the book means to her. John, can you talk a little bit about that? Speaking of being a teacher who's thinking about young people, makes me think about that part of your introduction and what this book means to your daughter.
Yeah, well, as she says, and her response is quoted in its entirety, and
Yes,
so unedited
beautiful.
and unexpurgated. I think Francesca speaks to the way all readers come to this book. She says specifically that it awakened for her an understanding of the beauty of Latinidad, of being Mexican American, being Chicana, Chicanx. You know, I think for anybody who reads Mango Street over these last 40 years, there was this kind of sense of being struck by a unique voice. It's not a book that you can easily categorize as a novel, for instance. It could be just as easily seen as a carousel of prose poems. It could be seen as a spiritistic rumination. Esperanza's consciousness is sort of roaming the world that she lives in, and she seems to have a kind of knowing that we can't really fully account for. She's got these powers of observation, but it's something that really struck me on this reading, the extent to which it prefigures so much of what Sandra has written about in terms of this spiritual orientation that is connected to literary creativity. So, Mango Street 40 years ago appeared, I think, as a thunderbolt in Chicanx letters, so in the literary culture of Mexican American communities. We'd been very familiar with movimiento-oriented idioms of literary expression. Suddenly there was this voice she was urban, it was an urban setting, it ranged in time, it had a memory of the past and a kind of intimacy of a family experience. But it was a thunderbolt in American letters. It wasn't illustrative of just saying, this is how Mexican Americans live, this is what we eat, this is how we dream and imagine. It was a kind of a reckoning of a presence of this literary consciousness that would then grow into the global scope that you talked about a moment ago, that this is a book that can really be understood as a deeply human presence. And I think that is one of the reasons why it's so important that it comes under the Everyman's Library imprint, that it kind of takes its place in this global arena of literary voices. Something that as Sandra pointed out when we were talking about developing the introduction, the community of writers that were part of this period, Sherry Moraga and Ana Castillo, women and queer writers who were really redirecting, Gloria Ansaldúa, redirecting the current of Chicanx creativity that was going to be transformative, not only for our letters, for Mexican American letters, but for American letters and for global literary culture. I think that's a really important part of what this really represents.
Well, I didn't see that when I got here. I got really baptism by fire by the local male writers who dismissed my book as not being political because it wasn't political in the way they knew political. And I just remember the reception I got. and how bad I felt when my book came out, that first year. It really didn't take off till like 8 years later.
Mm.
So it was a long overnight success. And I just remember thinking, this isn't, I was reacting to the genre of Viva la Raza literature when I
Yeah.
wrote the book. It was a response to the male perspective of my community. And I remember thinking, no, that's not how it is for me.
Mm.
So I was responding and writing from that perspective. So, of course, the male writers in San Antonio didn't recognize my book as something that was a part of the movimiento.
But you were bringing a host of diverse literary and artistic influences into play that went, well beyond where the movimiento literature had been.
Well, I think the only ones that were accepting and inclusive were you and Dr. Ellen Riojas Clark and the painter Cesar Martinez, who welcomed me because it was a very xenophobic reception I got to Texas in '84. It was so harsh that I thought, I'm going to stick this position out for a year, and then I'm leaving and I'm never coming back. That's what I promised myself. But I've always been one of those people that I can't quit a job until at least I've been there a year. And so I worked on the Texas Small Press Book Fair, and that was a success. Year after I had initiated my job here at the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center, and I left. I was planning to leave when I got a phone call from UT Austin giving me the Dobie Paisano residency. I had
Yeah.
a flower pot in my hand. I was wrapping with newspaper when they called and said, "You won, and you're going to have 6 months outside of Austin and a beautiful residency." And I thought, oh no. And I just said, oh, thank you. And I thought, now I have to buy a car. Now I have to stay in Texas. And it was as if Divina Providencia was saying, not so fast. And that stay at the Dobie Paisano changed my life. It really is what sealed me staying in Texas. Even if I couldn't find a job, which I could not, I kept going away and working in other institutions outside of Texas and coming back summers and saving my money and renting apartments for $200 a month for way after most apartments were not.
But living
$200 a
with the
month.
ghost of J. Frank Dobie there.
Oh,
That was
yes.
the
Yes.
Texas reckoning. The
I
Texas
forgot about
literary
that
reckoning.
ghost. I forgot about that. There's a good story, but I don't know if I can tell it on this radio show.
Do you want to tell it?
Well, I don't know. No, I better not. It's kind of
Okay.
X-rated.
Well, I do want to talk a little bit about this idea of not feeling that your book wasn't welcomed by certain people. And there's no accounting for taste or motives or whatever. But it makes me think about how, even though this has sold 7 million copies and it's been translated to 26 languages, et cetera, it's taught in the schools at all levels. And it's also been banned.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I have to clarify that the book may not have been well received by my fellow San Antonio writers, but it was well received by teachers and librarians. They were my advocates, and I thank them then and now for always supporting me. And then and now, librarians are always on the front line of defending books. But I don't think my book was targeted per se. Well, that's not true. It has been targeted sometimes because it's um, it deals with heavy topics, but it deals with them in a very subtle, poetic way, so that there are no bad words in my book. There's nothing graphic. A child could read it, and unless you're initiated into the trauma that I'm writing about, you won't know what I'm saying because I wrote about it slant so that it would not be caught by the censors. However, we have had the book banned in some instances, and I don't feel it's my book per se. I think sometimes it's the whole program that my book has been a part of that's created issues. For example, in Arizona, when the book was banned along with Mexican American Studies. So it wasn't specifically my book, but I think the whole idea of a community's consciousness that was questioned.
I think that there's no question about the fact that so many people have read this book, young people at all levels of education. I want to talk a little bit about that. I'm a teacher. I've used the book in my classes for many, many years. And I can tell you, I've had students say to me, students from the university say, I had to call my dad and read it to him. I just felt like sharing it with someone. Or I called my mom and I read her this vignette or that vignette. Or they'll say, I'm not selling this one back, right? At the end of the semester, they want to sell their books back, but not this one.
Oh,
So
that's so nice.
year after year of this, of
Yeah.
engaging with my students. And, we have to talk about the Bildungsroman of it all, the unreliable narrator of it all, and all of that. But they get to talk about houses and homes and family and friendships and growing up and rites of passage and death. And that the aspiration that maybe they haven't really identified yet, it's this nebulous thing, but Esperanza comes to it at a certain point near the end of the book. But one of the things that I'm always really struck by is that they want to talk about the three sisters. And we go back and forth about the three sisters. Is it something sort of mystical? Is it something supernatural? Is it something? And I always say to them, these are women of a certain age. They've been around and they see it all, and they're very perceptive, and they're just able to see something in Esperanza that they don't see every day or they don't see all the time in some of the other children. And they're like, no, it's something else. So we're usually a little bit divided, and it can be both. But I love that push and pull and that discussion and that debate that we always get to have. And it shows that the book is really a lot of different things to it still.
And I'm happy that you brought that up because those characters came to me when I was finishing the book in Greece. And so it makes sense that it would be a triad of women who are visionaries. Las señoras who you go to consult when you need a clairvoyant or you need a limpia. And I'm working on this year, not only is it the 40th anniversary, but Derek Bramell, the composer, and I are finishing House on Mango Street, the opera. So we've developed the three sisters as the tres chamanas. We call them the tres chamanas, and they're the ladies in the opera. They're the ladies who have the pushcart selling atole and tamales. And you will see them switch from their aprons to their full regalia and power when a scene happens that they need to come in and rescue and cleanse our protagonists from trauma. So it's really nice to, at this age, to look at a book I wrote when I started it when I was 21, and I'm 69 now, and to be redeveloping, rediscovering, fleshing out the characters, exploring the book, and going back and filling in the gaps. It's a great pleasure to collaborate with a musician, composer, who can say, well, what about for this character if we put this kind of music? And, just to work with one more dimension of theater and performance and lighting and costume. And it's just exciting.
That's so beautiful.
Yeah.
I will tell you that they always choose Alicia as their favorite. I want to be Alicia because she was really fighting for it. She was taking the bus and she was staying up all night and she had nobody to support her.
Right, because they're living that life.
Because they're living it.
Exactly.
It's really something else. They also tell me, just so you know, that you're the queen of the similes. They tell me that they understand things because of the way you describe them and that you are the queen of the similes.
Well, I don't try to make those comparisons. They just pop out of my head because I've always been like that even as a child. where everything came to me by way of simile and still does. And so it's not that I sit there scratching my
Yeah.
head thinking, how can I get a simile? No, they just bubble up.
Well, they say you nail it every time.
Thank you so much.
It communicates
I appreciate
so
it.
clearly.
I think one of the great things for me is that I'm alive and I get to meet my audience and to read their letters every month. My audience writes to me at my web address and sends me the most beautiful letters, whether they're in China or in Egypt, or whether there's someone from the Valley or from my own hometown, Chicago. And they write me such beautiful letters that if I ever doubt that I made a difference on this planet, I just have to whip out one of those letters and weep and think, how did I get so lucky?
Wow.
I have no idea. Qué suerte la mía. Me siento muy bendecida. I'm just
Mhm.
so lucky. And all my ancestors and angels have been helping me because there's no way. How is it that like the library isn't full of these stories? Because all the women I know from my community have lived extraordinary stories. And I'm just one of the few that path was open. I think that's why I'm so committed to working with other writers and working on Macondo workshop, and because I know there are writers as good as me and better. I know that. And it just happens that maybe they write poetry instead of fiction, or maybe they wrote 100 years ago, or they write in Catalan, or they're born in Mexico, whatever. I've just been very lucky that my ancestors were pushed out of Mexico during the Mexican Revolution. My grandparents, who couldn't read or write, somehow migrated and were migrant farm workers up along the Southwest and made it to Chicago and allowed me to get an education. I'm just, when I think about that, I have so much gratitude.
John Phillip, you refer to this story as a quest story in the introduction. You call it a quest. You use the word and the idea of journey and this path that Esperanza is on. Yesterday, I happened to be watching The Power of Film on Turner Classic Movies, documentary series about film. And someone they were interviewing there said, some of the most memorable films are not about journeys, they're about being trapped. And he kept using that word, trapped, trapped, trapped. And he talked about Shawshank Redemption, maybe that's expected. But then he talked about Mrs. Robinson, The Graduate. He talked about The Graduate. And other films that seemed unlikely to me as films about being trapped. And I kept thinking about The House on Mango Street. And I thought, is this about Esperanza on some certain level feeling trapped in a space, an emotional space, a mental space, a physical space that she wasn't necessarily proud of, happy with, satisfied with, or she wasn't going to settle for the fact that that was all there was. I kept thinking about that. It's very interesting. It seems so obvious as I'm saying it right now, but yeah, there it is. What do you think about that idea?
I think that's absolutely right, because when I was in my 20s writing it, I felt censored about what I was living, and I censored myself and felt censored at the workshop that I was studying at in Iowa. So I took an earlier voice. I like writers, young writers, to take an earlier time because they have some perspective. If they take an earlier time. So of course, if you're 21 and you take the perspective of 10 years ago, that's your childhood. And I was writing it, but I was still in my 20s feeling very trapped about what society was giving me, what my family expected of me, and what my community and my life was offering me. I didn't have a lot of options. And I felt that through Esperanza, I was being allowed to explore, okay, this is not what I want. I can see my neighbors and the people around me, but can I pick something that's not on the menu? And what is that I want? The women's movement wasn't giving it to me either, because I didn't identify with the white women's movement. And I didn't discover third world women's feminism till I left university. So I was asking through Esperanza something that Rosario Castellanos was asking, tiene que haber otro modo de ser. There has to be another way to be. But what is it? I was asking through her, all through my 20s, how do I get out of Chicago? How do I get out of the obligations my family has for me? I don't want to be an English teacher, but that's all I know how to do. I want to be a writer, but I'm ashamed to say it. And how do I, the daughter of an upholsterer and a housewife, the granddaughter of ancestors that maybe couldn't read or write, how do I claim that? I was asking that through my little girl character.
Yeah, that's something that I think is such an important part of the voice of Esperanza in Mango Street, or in the, as I've been calling it, the every mango now, the every mango. The fact that when we experience her voice, we are being given this incredible liberty to break out of all of the strictures that had prevailed up until this period in the mid-'80s. The movimiento literature sort of yoked creativity to activism and to the Aztec warrior mentality and all of those trappings that were very important in their time, and they had an incredible role to play, but they had become limiting in a sense. And she gives us the Esperanza's voice gives us a way of thinking about, a kind of a human spirit that's untethered, that has this connection. It's one of the reasons why it has that kind of global impact that people everywhere can identify with precisely her quest. In the case of Esperanza, she tells us at the very beginning, it's a quest for a home.
Mhm.
And it's very much about the way that she imagines this home to be, and it's a motif that carries on in Sandra's work in all kinds of different ways. That's a really important turn in Mexican American letters. The one that has given a lot of us permission to go all over the globe, all over the cosmos, in this search for a sense of belonging and presence, and the way that we can speak to it using literary creativity. We were talking about this earlier this morning, about writing as a practice that helps us toward an understanding of ourselves, the complexity of ourselves. No simple resolutions, but the idea of a writing practice that gives us a sense of connection to spiritual search. And when Sandra and I met 40 years ago, so it's 40th anniversary of our chance encounter, partly facilitated by the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center, because we were both finalists for the job that Sandra got. So then I was forced into a 20-year exile in New York City in shame. But one of the remarkable things about meeting Sandra then was the extraordinary power she already had in her 20s. We were in our 20s. To be serious about the writing path.
Mm-hmm.
That this wasn't just something you dabbled in, it wasn't something you aspired to for fame and fortune, that there was this dharma aspect to it, the kind of a spiritual path. And it was something I knew as well, but couldn't have articulated it in the way that Sandra did in that time, and express it in the writing of Mango Street, which I think was already, when you got here, it was slated for publication already at Arte Público, no?
I wrote it and finished it when I was 28, but it took 2 years before it came into print. There was some delays.
It was about to be published.
Yeah. So when I got here, I was 30. I had written it all from 21 to 28, and I was 30 years old, and the book came out when I was 30, but I finished it when I was 28. Yeah.
And it it captures the rich strains of Esperanza's voice in the way that Sandra was just talking about, captures the depth of our ancestral knowing, or the depth of our ancestral legacies, which we had not really yet fully fathomed, much less been able to access in terms of a way of thinking about making literary work. So, for instance, these days people are very proud, rightly so, to say, I'm first gen. I'm first gen, and that's something very important. The first in your family history to go to college, for instance, so higher ed. But what about all the other gens before that? That maybe not higher ed, but all kinds of life experiences and journeys and visions and acts of witness. How do we speak to them?
Yeah.
So we're infinite gen. We're sort of numberless gen, really, in terms of all that our ancestral legacy carries with it. And I think there's already that presence in Mango Street. It definitely comes forward in the stories that would follow, and in Caramelo, in the epic multi-generational telling in Caramelo.
I'm so glad you said that. Well, first, I want to say one thing first before I lose the thread. In the introduction that you wrote for this 40th edition from Everyman's Library, you say that in 1983, Sandra was vivacious, loquacious, audacious, with an electric halo of ebony curls. I just think that's so beautiful and so perfect. Writing was an act of bounding invention and social conscience, and that it was a lengthy and bumpy road to the Everyman's Library.
Yeah.
I think people take it for granted, right? That it was just like her star was on the rise. Yeah. And of course, we know that that's not the case.
As Sandra just said, it was an 8-year overnight sensation.
Yeah.
An overnight sensation that took 8 years to materialize.
And went through a dark night of the soul in my 33rd year, which was, I always call the year of my near death, because I went through such a deep clinical depression that I considered very seriously in many different ways of exiting my life. It just seemed the least painful way to survive was to die. And so in my 33rd year, when I was teaching at Cal State Chico, I had intended and planned out. I always thought that, when you call suicide hotlines, that, it's people that are dramatic. And no, they really are. They ask you when you call these suicide hotlines a specific question like, how do you plan to kill yourself? And if you're calm and you have it all thought out, then they worry about you. And I was very calm and had everything very deeply planned out, because I felt in my 33rd year that House on Mango Street was not enough. It had garnered me maybe $500 every edition, and $500 was not enough to prove that I could take care of myself. And I felt ashamed that I had to keep borrowing from my family. I felt like I can't even support myself by the one thing I know how to do. So I felt like people my age at 33 had cars and health insurance and jobs, and I was a reluctant migrant professor following the food supply, taking a job, Chico, just moving around. I couldn't find a job in Austin, and I'd quit my job after a year in San Antonio. So I felt like, yeah, you know how to write and you've written this book, but so what? And when you measure yourself against other people your age, you're doing yourself a disservice, because your path is not their path. I learned that afterwards, but I went through a very severe depression. And something common for working class people, I didn't know that I could seek help with a therapist, because when you come from a working class home, if you tell your mother, as I did, I'm depressed, my mother said, "What are you depressed about? I had 7 kids." And it was true. I didn't have any kids. She had 7 kids. And what was I depressed about? Because I couldn't make money and I was ashamed of borrowing again. So I just said, "Okay, yeah, Ma, I'll talk to you later." And I didn't know that a heart wound was as serious as a flesh wound. And there was no shame if you needed to see someone to help you survive it. So I'd like to talk about that even though I had the success of House, there were deep, dark nights of the soul. I learned about, one, the depression we have as women, the depression we have as artists, the depression that we have as working class people in higher education, where we feel we are interlopers and don't belong. We don't see ourselves in literature. We don't see ourselves in art. We don't see ourselves in the classroom. And that can create a lot of doubts. So I went through a very close call. And fortunately, my intuition has always saved my life. I went home for Christmas to my mother's address, because that was my only permanent address. And my mom said, "There's a letter from Washington, D.C. I think it's good news." I didn't take off my coat. I put my suitcase down. I opened the letter, and it said, "Congratulations. National Endowment for the Arts has granted you a grant for $20,000. And I just exhaled and said, "Mom, give me some paper." And I come from a house where my mom doesn't have stationery. She had a ring binder with a spiral. That's what I wrote on. And I wrote to the NEA and thanked them and told them they literally had saved my life.
Wow. I didn't know the story, Sandra.
Yeah, yeah. I served on the NEA as one of the judges, and thanks for the 2 NEA grants that they had granted me. And I said, "You have to let the artists know that they've gotten this award as soon as possible." Because when I was considering, my path out of this life, that's when my manuscript was being judged. But they couldn't tell me until later in the year, because the budget for the NEA had not been finalized.
Mm. Oh my goodness.
I know. So one of the things I always say when I look at things like the Everyman's edition is, good thing I'm not dead.
Well, I want to talk about these paths. You mentioned them too, and the other gens,
Mm.
because the other gens are in this book too. And the other gens are the upholsterer father and the housewife who took you to the library.
Yeah.
So I feel like yeah, like we need to talk about that too, or think about that too when we think about something like this.
Yeah.
That this path started with them, the other gens, and the paths that they've been on. Alicia's father, who she might think isn't supportive, but her mother has died, and her father doesn't have the wherewithal to support what she wants to do, to go to school and so on. And there are many other vignettes, many other characters like that, the other paths, the other stories that are told. I just think that's so important. So I'm so glad you mentioned your mother. That yes, even though she's saying, what do you have to be sad about? I've heard that too. But she's the other Jen, and she really inspired your love of reading and books.
Yeah, and she also is like the tough character in my life that has allowed me to survive all the blows that life has given me, because, she was trying to make me strong by saying, "What have you got to be depressed about?" That was her way. But she also was the one that said, "Open that letter. I think it's good news," before I even took my coat off. So, she was a tough cookie, as she's
Tough
described in the
cookie.
book. And she had this itch to be an artist and was never able to satisfy it, and took us to the library and to the museums because of her own absolute need to have something other than the housewife's life, or she was going to go crazy. And she opened the path without meaning to all of my siblings and myself, to have a better education than what our neighborhood would have afforded us, what our economic status would have afforded us, because my mom was in museums since she was a child. She would go with her neighbors. She would play hooky. She would climb out the window and escape from her Saturday chores and walk from Halsted and Roosevelt down to the Field Museum, which is a couple miles. And she would spend the day in the museum with her friend Frances, and there's photos of my mom with her friend Frances. And all through her life, they would go to the planetarium and the museums in downtown, which at that time were free on the weekends. And my mom just knew that growing up, that was the thing you did. And that's what you did when you had 7 kids. And you can't pay admission on the other days. You go on the weekend and you take your children, and maybe she was with us, or she might have sat in the park and listened to an aria at the Grant Park Bandshell and said, "I'm going to be right here. You go in there and leave me alone for an hour," And we did, and we got so much out of it. Even though we were running around and yelling and chasing each other, a lot of what I saw in those museums crops up in my writing. The Matisses and the Van Goghs and the gem room and the dinosaurs and the mummies. All of those things are part of my education, thanks to my mom, who wanted to be an artist.
It's so beautiful. It makes me think about my parents and my connection to Everyman's Library. We would go to Port Aransas for family vacation, very low frills. But there was a place called Souvenir City that sold souvenirs. And in the rear of the store, there were floor to ceiling to floor shelves of used books. I guess people on the island would go and drop their books off there when they were done with their, Reader's Digest abridged or whatever. And there were, my parents would say no to tchotchkes and souvenirs and, shark's tooth necklace, not another shark's tooth necklace, or a sand dollar in a box, why? But they said yes to the books every time. And so I always got to buy books. And some of those books were, yes, those Reader Digest abridged or unabridged. And also Everyman's Library books. And there was, Chekhov and the rest. And it was something for me, like, it was just seeing those two words, Everyman's Library, it felt to me like this must be something really good. This must be something really, really special. And I want to read it. So that's my feeling about, oh my gosh, when I heard that The House on Mango Street would be published, I just thought, there it is. This is perfect. This is absolutely perfect. And I think about that girl in Souvenir City saying, oh my gosh, I want that one.
I had that situation too, Yvette, but I had it at the Sears Roebuck mail order store on Homan in Chicago. It had a bargain basement, and a lot of damaged items were returned and sold at super discounts. And that's where I bought my first book ever, a copy of Alice in Wonderland, one of my favorite then and now.
Still one of your favorites, right?
Yes, I still have it in my bedside. A new edition, of course, not the 50 cents cheapy edition that I bought and spilled perfume on. But it was every time I opened that book, I would smell it. It smelled so great.
How beautiful! I love that. I love that. I wonder. I'm putting you on the spot, but I wonder if you would read A House of My Own.
Yeah, I like that chapter. It's a beautiful aria that Derek Bramell has composed with these words. A house of my own. Not a flat. Not an apartment and back. Not a man's house. Not a daddy's. A house all my own. My porch and my pillow, my pretty purple petunias, my books and my stories. My 2 shoes waiting beside the bed. Nobody to shake a stick at. Nobody's garbage to pick up after. Only a house quiet as snow. A space for myself to go. Clean as paper before the poem. I think that last paragraph is my epigraph.
That's so beautiful. Thank you.
Epitaph. Epigraph and epitaph.
Let us say epigraph today. Sandra Cisneros, thank you so much.
Lovely. Thank you, Yvette. You're always a pleasure to talk to.
John Phillip Santos, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Yvette. Thank you, Sandra.
Oh, for all their friendship then and now. Gracias a ti.
So many untold stories that we can get to another occasion.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us. I'm Yvette Benavides from Texas Public Radio's Book Public podcast. Please subscribe. Thanks.